Okay, so I got that you're kind of doing the loop there, where you're saying the mouse event is on the player, and the player is passed into the mouse event, right? That little circular thing that you got going on there, and then what we're doing after the button has been pressed is we're setting the initial state to not firing, right? Because we want to start someplace, and then after that we're saying, okay, now we're firing, and then we want to play the shooting animation, and now we're going to go into making the arrows go in the right direction. Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, let me start over here. Okay, first of all, when I create the player, I create a variable called isFiring, and I set it to false. Now, the reason I do that is because I may have mentioned this before. The mouse event is very noisy. So you get a new mouse event every time you click a button, move a scroll wheel, or move the mouse 1 pixel. So if you think about it, you can move the mouse hundreds of pixels. So you're going to get a mouse event regularly. You just get all these mouse events. Boom, you're going to get a barrage of mouse events coming in. And so assume that I have clicked the button and then I'm kind of like jiggling my mouse a little bit because my hand is unsteady, or I'm having a good time at the game, I'm moving, I'm doing my thing. Then you're going to get a bunch of events where this is set to true. So what you need to do is you don't want to like constantly reset the firing algorithm. So what I do is I say, start off with a flag on the player saying I'm not firing, because that's the state I start in.
Yeah.
And then the first time I detect the button has been pressed, and the firing flag is still set to false, I set it to true. So I click the button, I'm moving my mouse. Everything after that first click is going to be ignored. Why? Because the first click came in and it said this to true. And so it's going to come to this check the second time, the third time, the fourth time, and it's going to go, nope, it's not false, it's true. And so we ignore all this code, and it just drops out and does nothing. Otherwise, it would set the animation again, it would set a new perform with delay, it would do the fire. Well, this code's a little bit excessive. It would do the firing, it would set the I just fired the arrow, everything would be all goofy.
So, and this is happening, I mean, we're talking like fractions of a second sort of stuff.
Yeah, this is happening every frame.
Okay.
What happens is because it's a noisy event, you'll get a bunch of these stacked on top of each other. So every frame, it'll process like 10, if you're moving the mouse a lot, it could process 10 mouse events, one after the next.
Okay.
So, which of course would just blast you.
So really, we're compensating for the fact that the input device is we're using it in a way that isn't really what it's intended for, right? I mean, we're not really, you know what I'm saying? Like all these events are being passed in all the time from the mouse, and we only want to pay attention to a portion of that.
I want to grab a select few and ignore it most of the time.
Right.
Right? Because everything you pay for is, well, you pay for it. So do as little processing as you can. And one way to do that is just to ignore an input when you don't care about it. And so that's what I'm doing, basically.
Okay. And then, and so this is one of those desktop concepts, right, that we didn't have to deal with with mobile, but, well, not necessarily.
Yeah, we don't have to deal with it as much in mobile because this is not true, though, because remember we had a discussion in a previous show where I talked about touch coalescing?
Right. Right.
So that's
similar.
I do mouse coalescing too, but it did not apply well to this situation because what I didn't want to do was miss certain inputs because I coalesced. Basically, coalescing is in a sense ignoring extra inputs, and so that's complicated because an input may have multiple state components to it. Was the button push? Was the button down? You can imagine a case where if I was doing mouse coalescing, where I would throw away all the extra mouse inputs and just grab the one that came on the frame, then I might miss the button presses because it always came after the move. Did a move, did a button press. And I only paid attention to the one where I didn't have the button pressed down. I threw it away. I'd never get any button fires. So I needed to catch every one and only pay attention to the ones that were exactly what I needed. So I'm not coalescing. I am simply saying, yep, I'm not firing, and you're pressing a button. What's shoot that bugger.
Okay.
So speaking of shooting the bugger, I'm going to go ahead and, I said we wouldn't do this, and I'm doing it anyways. We're going to go through this briefly, because I went through all the trouble to do the drawing code, doggone it, and I wanted to at least show you part of what's going on here. So we're in here. I'm setting the doDebug variable to true up here. So I pass in true. I say self : fire arrow. And when I use the colon notation, what that says is pass in the calling object as the first variable, and then everything else that you pass after that comes as the second, third, and fourth variables, and so on. So I set this to true. As always, I check to see if we're running, because I deferred the call to that by 250 milliseconds. So in that quarter second, the game could have stopped running for some reason. So we're still running. You can ignore this code for right now, but basically what it is a limiter, so it doesn't let us fire any more arrows than our max arrow count is allowed to be. But this is for another show. The arrow shooting code will evolve over time. Right now, we just care about how to get that arrow moving in the right direction. So we'll skip down. Skip the code that says the limit fire rate. Update the arrow time, and go to where it says create arrow, which is about line 226. Maybe a little bit different when I commit this code, because I think there was a bug I need to fix. We call the arrow maker. Arrow maker is a piece of code that creates a sprite that is appropriate to the direction the arrow is supposed to be pointing in. So we pass in the group that we want it to be in, the starting position, which is the player's position, and the angle that my angle, which is the player's current angle, and 1, which is the scaling factor. So all of the makers, the sprite makers, have scaling factors that you can pass in, and they're currently all scaled to 1, but of course if you want the arrows to be a little bigger or a little smaller, you could change this to greater than 1 for bigger or less than 1 for smaller. Now 1 is the appropriate size. We add a physics body. We use a dynamic body because the arrow is going to be moving. I use a radius, so I don't make it the shape of the arrow. I just make this little circle. So if I were to turn on debugging, which I won't do, as the arrow is flying, you would see a little circle around the center of the arrow. But it's just approximate, it's good enough. And as I said on a previous episode, circles are better because they're the quickest calculation you can do for collisions. So the arrow's going to be moving quickly. You just want to do a quick calculation. Use a circle body. It'll work.
And the circle is in the middle of the arrow, you say?
Yeah, it'll be in the middle. It'll be at the position of the arrow. So it'll look like it's in the middle of the arrow because the graphic for the arrow may extend beyond the circle radius, which is fine because the arrow is going to get there quickly enough that even a glancing hit should be close enough for that circle in the middle to actually hit the enemy. And so you can adjust the size of this. You don't want it to be actually the full size of the arrow, because then an arrow that goes by the side will still hit it because of the radius being so far out from. So the arrow is very narrow but long. So you don't want the radius to be half the length of the arrow, because then it'll seem as if the arrow is behaving like this wide body with it is not. So an arrow that goes by.
And is the circle not on the arrowhead because you're also using a circle for the enemy, and that would look odd?
The circle is not on the arrowhead because the position in Corona is based on the center of the graphic. The default position, the anchor position, is 0.5, 0.5. So when you draw, for example, the player here, you can see that there's a red line, which is, in a moment, you'll see signifies the direction the arrow is going to go. Mm-hmm. The center of our player is where that starts, mm-hmm. and that is the position. The position of our player is right here, and the graphic is rendered relative to that around the center. That is the center, it is the position. So it used to be in Corona that the anchor position was 0, 0, which was the upper left corner. Mm-hmm. So that has changed back when we did the transition to graphics 2.0.
Yeah, the reason I ask is, it just seems like an arrow, right? In physical space, the arrowhead would hit the player first.
Yeah, you would think, oh, maybe I should move that over to the arrowhead. The problem is now you got to translate the position of the body. It's a lot of math. Mm-hmm. At the 0 angle, it's easy. You just move it up a little bit. But as soon as it's facing at an odd angle, it's a tremendous amount of math to do, and it doesn't buy you anything. Because the arrowhead, if you think about it, the arrow shaft is going to point, it's going to pass through the same position that the arrowhead does. It's going to be very little difference, deviation. In the time it takes for that arrowhead and the arrow body to move, there'll be very little difference between the point of impact of where the arrowhead looks like it's hitting and the middle of the shaft actually travels.
Okay.
So if you have a small circle around the center, it's almost the same as having put it around the head. And for accuracy's sake in a game, it's fine. It's a trade-off. Do I want to do all that extra calculation to get that arrow body in the right position, or do I just have the arrow moving fast enough so that they're relatively